Hello and welcome to my video tutorial on how to print this really awesome chessboard. I'm calling this Toolpath painting because you can see here there's like patterns on the print that are generated by the Toolpath. Here you can see what the board looks like with some of my drooloop jellyfish chess pieces. You can also play checkers on this. This video shows how this thing basically prints upside down. So here's what it looked like when I took it off the printer, more or less. I printed it in 4 pieces, upside down, and so that's why it has such a nice shiny surface. You can see here it's almost like a mirror. That's because it was printed on the glass, and that's where the shininess comes from. And by just using only the first layer, I'm able to create some interesting tool paths and incorporate that into the model. I'm going to give you a quick description, and then later on I'm going to give you a really detailed description, including my OpenSCAD code, in case you want to create your own different shapes. Okay, so how was this chessboard printed? First I'm going to give you a really quick description, and then later on I'm going to go into very detailed description. But basically here I had to print it in 4 pieces because my print bed couldn't print the whole thing. This was printed upside down on the glass. So like this is the top, this is the face that was down. That's why it's so smooth and shiny, because this was all printed on the glass. So the print prints upside down like this. There's multiple STL files used to create this pattern. So first I'm going to show you this because it shows up better on the camera. So each tile consists of multiple STL files. So the one of the STL files was just this background image without the star in the center. It was hollow in the center, and I sliced it using just like a normal single wall perimeter and normal infill. So the normal infill is what generates these lines going back and forth like this, and that's what generates the background. The second STL file is just the inside star part of these patterns, and on that I used a really high wall count so that when it printed it, it generated these concentric patterns on the inside. So that was each tile has 2 separate STL files that were used. Because there's 2 different colors, there was one file that was for the 2 files for the blue ones and 2 files that made up the other color, in this case orange. There was then, and so then like the 5th STL file then were the border lines here, the part that created this, and those were all printed on the first layer without taking any of the other layers off the printer. The 6th STL file was the one that was this background part, which started at the 2nd layer. So there was no first layer for this STL file. And then there was actually 4 of these, 1 for each quadrant, that was getting printed. And so that's how this got printed, I guess. Also, let me show you when I really, this is a smaller version. When I actually did print them, the border, I left the border the same size all the way around, and this body part that's 1 for each quadrant actually only goes into one of the corners, and so you would end up trimming off this plastic just with a craft knife to make all the pieces fit together. So this would have been like basically how this piece was printed. So when this originally printed, there was extra border around both of these edges that I had to trim off so that they would all go together nicely. Now I want to just say a few words about the first layer thickness and nozzle sizes. Because all of these patterns print as first layers only, when I use a transparent color like this with the white color on the background, the thicker the first layer, the more intense the color is. So here you can see this was printed with a 0.4 millimeter nozzle, which only allowed me to go with a layer thickness of 0.3 millimeters. This was printed with the 0.8 millimeter nozzle, which allowed me to go with a first layer thickness of 0.6 millimeters. So I've got a thicker layer of transparent plastic on this one, which gave me a deeper color. And I also kind of liked the thickness of the nozzle pattern, and that's just totally up to how, what you're trying to accomplish. One of the test files that I uploaded is this file here, which has different numbers of points on the stars. This was printed with the all opaque plastic with the different color on the for the border line. This is one of the files I've uploaded in case you want to print it off and test slicer settings and things like that, or test what kind of patterns you're getting with your nozzle size. So once again, this was the 0.8 millimeter nozzle. Same file, but all printed in one color here with a 0.4 millimeter nozzle. And again, then I had to use a 0.3 millimeter first layer height. And you can see over here how important it is that your bed is level, because my bed wasn't like super perfectly level all the way across. So this side of the print suffered more than this other side where I had it dialed in better. I also tried to print it with my 2.0 millimeter nozzle, and it's kind of interesting, but I didn't feel that was gave me the effect that I wanted, so I ultimately ended up going with my 0.8 millimeter nozzle when I printed the whole. Okay, quick rundown. How did I do this on a single extruder machine? The first file is the background of the blue. The second file I printed was the inside of the blue. Then I did a color change. Then I printed the G-code for the background of the orange. Then I printed the G-code for the inside of the orange. Then I did another color change on my printer, and I printed the background border lines all on the first layer still, then color change, and the last thing is the background, the body that's holding it all together, which really doesn't have a first layer on that G-code file. Okay, so this is the very gory details, or basically walking you through generating the 9 STL files needed to print the chessboard that I had shared online. First of all, that we're in OpenSCAD now, and I'm just going to quickly run through these top variables that are exposed so you can modify things as needed. I'm going to preview the file here, and one of the things I want to point out is when you preview the file here, in the console window, you can see I put a little echo in here that will tell you how large of a print bed area you need to print the file. So if you have a smaller print bed, you might want to just double check here to make sure that the file you're generating will fit on your print bed. And I'll quickly run over what the file is. The thing that makes the file really bigger than what you might expect if you just add up the size of these squares are these little registration points here that are on all the 4 corners of the model. Every time you generate an STL file, these registration points are going to be part of your file, and that is what allows the slicer to always place the different STL files on the exact same place on the print bed, which is really important so that everything lines up. If the slicer is automatically just centering the file, which is what it normally does, you want the outer dimensions of your file to be identical all the time. Alright, so let's look at these variables here. So here we've got the size of the square, which is each of these little squares here. So if I made this a lot smaller and re-render this, you can see that I've got a much smaller chessboard, and in my echo command down here you can see that I need a much smaller bed. Just 105.2 by 105.2 is the size of the print bed that would be needed to print this section of the chessboard. Of course, I had to split the chessboard up into 4 pieces to fit on my bed because I only have a 200 by 200 millimeter print bed. So this is how you can change the size of the squares. Here I'm going to set it back to 41. The surface thickness of the board first layer, that's the next one. So this setting here is the thickness of the first layer. So the first layer we're printing in color, and that is going to be, that needs to correspond to your slicer settings. In this case, I'm planning on using a 0.8 millimeter nozzle, which will allow me to use a first layer thickness of 0.6 millimeters. If you're using a 0.04 millimeter nozzle, you're going to probably have to make this like a 3 or something smaller, which is fine. It just I ended up using the 0.8 for reasons that the colors looked better and the image, the pattern looked better. So the thickness for the whole board, including the first layer, is 3 millimeters. If you want a thicker board, make this thicker. That just determines the thickness of the layer 2 on up, so to speak, because that's one of the STL files we're generating. Outer border thickness in millimeters. That's this border here that goes around the outside. So for example, if I made that like 15 and repeated that, you'd see that the outer border is very thick now. So that is how you control that. Let me set that back. 5 was good for what I was doing. Inner border thickness. That are these lines in between the squares. I'm recommending that you always go with 2 times the nozzle size that you're using. Since I'm going to be using a 0.08 millimeter nozzle, I set this to 1.6. If you're using a 0.4 millimeter nozzle, you could probably get away with 0.8, which would give you a much finer line. Or if you just wanted thicker lines, you could go with like a 3. And notice changing this number does not change the overall size of the board that you're generating, or so I'm going to set that back to there. The number of star points, that is the shapes that go in here. So if you wanted a 4-pointed star, you could do like that. If you wanted a 7-pointed star, you see how that works. You just keep changing these numbers. Now I opted, if you go, so here's something I want to point out too. If you go with an odd numbered star, I felt that like in this case, these light colored squares, the star is kind of pointing up with the odd number going up, odd point. And then the other color, the odd point, is going down. I felt that visually, the one person on the one side of the board should see their colors going away from them, and the person on the other side of the board should see their colors going away from them. So that's why I made it so that the stars would change orientation when you're using an odd number. You can even do something weird like 3.5 I think might work. Yeah, it makes an interesting shape. It's just all math. But ultimately, I decided when I did my board to go with 8 because it was symmetrical. No matter how you looked at the board, it was the same way. And the 8 kind of gave me this cool feeling of, when you're moving out of a square, you can either go diagonally if that's the board piece you're using, or both sides. So 8 was the number that I ultimately decided to use when I printed mine. Let me scroll down here a bit. The next one is the star shrink value, and this is so that the star is inside of this. I wanted there to be a gap around the star in the center of each square. So if we just set this back to 0 and render this, you can see that the star goes outside of the borders, and that's not visually very good. So what I was recommending is it was 4 times your lines, but that didn't really look that good ultimately. But so anyways, put a number in here, shrink your star down so that it doesn't touch the borders. Reg space value is how far away these little dots are going to be from the actual print that you want. You're going to have to peel these dots off the build plate in between each print because they're going to be in every STL file, and you're going to be generating 9 STL files. You just don't want these to be stuck on there. So if I made this number too small, like if I make this like a 1 millimeter and then re-rendered it, you can see that these squares are getting a lot closer to my print, and so I just want to have like a good amount of space away. You don't want to make that number too big because this number does affect the overall size you're going to need on your print bed here for this STL to fit on your print bed. So keep that in mind. The XNum is the number of times you are going to repeat your squares in the X direction. So if I change that to a 2, you can see now I only have 2 squares in the X direction. Or if and this Y num is how many squares to go in the Y direction. So if I change that to a 2 also, you can see that now we're just going to print a 2 by 2. If you've got a large printer and you can do it all in one go, I mean, what the heck, make this an 8 by 8. Oops, make this an 8 by 8 and print the whole chessboard all at once. My print bed would not allow for that. In fact, to do that, you can see here you'd need a print bed of 349.2 by 349.2, and I do not own a printer like that. So I'm going to put this back down to 4 by 4, and that's the size pieces that I'm going to generate to put together to my chess set. Okay, now we're done defining the dimensions for the file that we're going to create, the chessboard we're going to create. Next we're into these 4 render values. Color to make, part to print, part to make, quadrant, and quadrant main. If you scroll down a little bit farther, you can see here's some notes that you'll need to make this following 9 STL files, and these are the files I'm going to run through right now really quickly. And this kind of helps you see the values that you need to use for those 4 things. Right now I'm using what I call visualize the surface mode, where I've got like more turned on than I want. And if I actually did render the file right now, I would just, which I'm going to do, then I would just end up with like a solid blank, solid piece of model that isn't going to create anything interesting at all. So that's no fun. What we're going to need to do is first we're going to generate the color 1 outer part, which you can see by those notes. Color to make, we're going to do color 1, so I'm going to make this a 0. See, color 1, 0. Part to make, I want to make the outer square part, so I'm going to set this to a 1. And then as far as the quadrant's concerned, that we've got, I'm just going to set this for 1 right now, which would be quadrant 1 outer border. And then for the quadrant main, because I'm first generating the parts for the surface of the board, this last variable is for the body, second layer on up. So I don't want any part of this body part to render right now because that's a completely separate file. So I'm going to use 6, which is the no body second layer on up. So there, 6, it's still 6. Okay, so now when I preview this, you can see what I have is, so I've got my outer part for the color 1. This quadrant isn't right. If I go down here and look at my notes, you can see that basically what I should have had for that value was a 6. But I'm leaving it as a 1 to see, like, this would be the part that goes in the first quadrant. If I make this a 2, then this is the part that would go into the second quadrant of the board. 3 changes the border, and this is basically gonna be the same later on. The third quadrant. 4 is the part of the board that would be the fourth quadrant. 5 was the all corners, which I was using to visualize it, and 6 is no border. Now in this situation, I don't want a border because all I want is, this is the first color. It's only going to be printed on the outside of the model, and that is what I would render and then save as an STL file. So that's the first color outer STL file. The next file we need to do, if we come down here, look at it, is the color1 inner, and you can see that the second variable has to become a 2, and that is because part to make now needs to be 2 square inner, which is the stars part. So if I make this a 2 and render that, now you can see I've got the stars part, and these registration dots are always in the same place. That's important because that helps my STL files always land in the same place. I would render that and save that file. I've already done that, so I'm just gonna I'll skip actually rendering and saving right now and naming those files. I'll show you that when I get to the slicer settings. So then we need to do the second color, outer, so I'm going to change this to a 1 so I can get my color number 2. I'm going to change this back to a 1 so I can get the outer background part. So if I preview that, you can see now that's the other set of squares, outer part. Then to get the inner part for the second color, I'm going to change that to a 2 and render that. That's the inner part for the second color of squares. And now I've done all 4 STL files, which are going to be the inner parts. Now, still on the first layer, I need the lines that go between all this stuff. So down here, you can see that the lines for the surface, and you can see here, also in these notes, it says same for all quadrants. So these parts, I decided, I'm not going to change them at all, and this is also important for the odd numbered squares. You don't want to keep the surface of the board is going to be the same for the colored parts and the squares regardless of which quadrant you're printing. So you don't need to have a separate one of these for all 4 quadrants. You're going to use the same ones every time. Surface lines. So this needs to be a 3, which is both colors because the lines go between everything. This needs to be a 4 for the inner border lines. And then this now, I do want the outer border lines, and so what I decided to do was to do 5, and I'll show you that in a second, for all corners. So now when I render this, what I get is a perfect outside border that's the same all the way around, and my little lines that go in between there. This is the STL file for the borders. Now, if I did this to make it simple, so I could use the same file for all of the surfaces, and then what I'm going to end up doing is trimming off this plastic for each of the quadrants depending on which quadrant it was. This saves you from having to generate 4 different STL files. That would be for the inside, and it also made it easier for me to print that really thin inside line by kind of basically using like a brim. You could make this a 1 and generate the STL file, but then what you see here is that this line here, basically because that's butting up against another piece that's going to go right next to it, has to be just a single nozzle width, because remember I said that these lines should be 2 times your nozzle width, and my slicer does not like to try to do a single nozzle width path. It always wants to go up and down. So by just leaving this as a 5, I'm saving the number of files I'm printing, I'm making the slicing easier, and I can just trim that off, and it worked out really well actually. So you save this file. That's our 5th STL file, which is the lines. So now we need to generate the last 4 STL files, which are the body part, which is basically layer 2 on up. So you can see here that the first number doesn't matter what it is because it's ignored. So I'm not even going to worry about that. So for parts to make, this needs to be 5, which basically says no first layer objects, which is why it doesn't matter what this color to make variable is, because that whole thing is being ignored by the fact that I'm using a 5 here for no first layer objects. The quadrant needs to be a 6, which is no first layer border, because this is the part that's referring to the border. And then the last variable for this first one is going to be a 1, which is body, part, whatever, for the first quadrant, second layer on up. So when I preview that, what I get is this solid thing, and I'm going to turn this on its side so you can see that. So this is a lot thicker, and let me see if I can view it like this. And what you can see here is that basically, looking at it on its side, here's the registration mark. That's on everything. That's on the first layer, and that's at the thickness that we've specified as what we're going to be slicing the file with. And you can see here the model itself starts second layer on up. So this is going to generate an STL file that isn't going to, it's only going to print these dots in the first layer, and then it's just going to print this first quadrant. And so there's my first quadrant. It has a corner here, and this is completely flush with the other pieces that are going to be printed. So I would render this file, save that off, and then I would just go through and then I would make changes to a 2 for the second quadrant. I would render that. Here's my second quadrant. Then I would change that to a 3, render that and save it. That's my third quadrant. And then change this to a 4, render that and save it. That's my fourth quadrant. So now I've got my 9 STL files saved out. So we're going to now switch over to Cura, which is where we're going to do our slicing. And I'm going to import, here's my 9 files, and so you can see I've named them outer color 1, outer color 2, inner color 1, inner color 2, all the lines, and then main quadrant 1, 2, 3, 4. So the first file we're going to do is color 1 outer. I'm going to open that up, and you can see here's color 1, the outer part of it, and I'm going to go look at the layer setting really quickly. And the thing that I used on this one to get a really good background was I went over here on my shell wall count and I changed that to a 1. So what that did was it just gave me this outer line, and then this infill was just back and forth. It gave me that nice pattern that looked really good. So then I would save this G code off to my STL or to my SD card. That's the color 1 job. Then let me clear that. I would open up color 1 inner, and well, and basically you would slice color 2 outer the same way. But when we slice the inner part, I want to have that concentric pattern in there, so I'm going to change my wall count to like a higher number, like 12 or something, and now I'm getting this toolpath where it's doing these concentric lines, and that's how I ended up slicing for my inner star part of the board STL file. And if the number is not, let's put a 5 in here just so you can see. If the number is not big enough, you can see that there's like some infill in the middle there. Maybe 3 would be a better example. You don't want to see this. You want, or well, maybe if you do. I mean, but for the pattern that I generated, I wanted to have these concentric lines going all the way to the center. So I just, it looks like basically in this case 6 is going to be a high enough number to make it so that we have completely concentric circles going in there to the middle. And you can see in the layer count there's only a single layer. There's no numbers over here. Let me clear this. And that's basically how you're going to render all these things. Create and render. That's how you're going to slice them. Same thing with lines. You're going to slice that as a single job with all of the lines showing up. I did end up doing my lines with a lower wall count because I wanted to have like a nice outside, and I didn't mind the fact that I was getting some infill on the outside part there. Once again, you can see it's a really short print job. It's only printing a single layer. These little registration points, which are in every single print job, you will have to pick those off the bed in between the print jobs. The other ones are all going. Each job prints somewhere the other job hasn't printed, so they're not going to print over each other at all. But these little registration points do need to be removed because they would start to goop up and print on top of each other. Now let's look at the quadrants. So that's the next. So that's these first 5 print jobs that you've already saved off as G-code. Then you've got quadrant 1. We're going to open that up, and what we're going to have here is, if I use my layer view and scroll down, you can see the first layer, all it's doing is printing these registration blocks, because by the time we're running this print job, the print bed is already filled up on the first layer in this area. We've already got all our colors down and everything's ready. All we need is that second layer on up to fuse everything together and give our board some thickness. So if I go to layer 2, then you'll see, okay, now all of a sudden it's printing, and here it's printing everything. It's sealing it all up together. And then what I ended up doing was just leaving the back open because I didn't want to take the time to have all that print off. You certainly can do whatever you want there. I was just trying to save plastic and print time, and I felt that this amount of infill and no back layer was going to be plenty strong enough. And I think what I ended up doing, I probably went up with like maybe a 3 or a 4 walls, perimeters, and then a really high infill rate. 20 millimeter distance and the infill, just so there would be 2 centimeters between each one. So that was the creating of the STL files and slicing them in Slicer and preparing them to get ready. So there you go.